Hi and welcome back. In tonight's lesson we're going to be taking a look at what is the difference between RAW and JPEG. Well, RAW is precisely that. It's the raw light hitting your sensor, getting converted into ones and zeros and plumped out in a file. JPEG, on the other hand, goes through your camera's imaging sensor, goes through processing and gives you essentially what the camera thinks is the best picture based on the settings that you have in the camera. Now, there are a multitude of differences between RAWs and JPEGs. One of the main ones being a RAW file, since it's the raw data. It's usually 14 bits per channel nowadays on modern cameras. You can do a lot more with it in post-processing. You can lift shadows, reduce highlights. There's just so much more that you can do post-processing. A JPEG, everything's baked in through the camera and what your settings are on the camera. You don't have as much information because a JPEG is a compressed file. Therefore, you're actually missing some data. So when it comes to post-processing, you're limited in what you can do. Another of the main differences are RAW files, just because it's pure raw data, are usually 5 to 6 times the size of a JPEG file. An example of that is my Canon 1DX Mark II. A RAW file is a 20 megapixel camera. A RAW file on that will come out at roughly 21 megabytes for one image, a CR2 file. A JPEG comes out at roughly 5 megabytes. So an easy way to think about the difference between RAW and a JPEG is if you think about it like pieces of meat. A nice steak that you get at your butcher or delicatessen. On the one hand, you have your raw piece of meat, ready to cook. You can throw it in the grill or your outside barbie and grill it, cook it just the way you want it. On the other hand, you have a well done steak ready to eat. Now, if you like well done steaks, that's great, it's ready to eat right there. You can take your raw piece of meat and make it well done if that's what you want to do. But what happens if you like medium or rare? Well, you can't take your well done piece of steak and reverse the process, but you can with your raw meat. That's the same with files. JPEG, everything's baked into it already. A RAW file is raw data. You can take your RAW file and make it into an exact copy of the JPEG if that's what you want, but you also have the leniency to do other things with it as well. Things that you can't do with a JPEG file. Common sense tells you that if you've got a 5 megabyte file versus a 20 megabyte file, there's a lot more information in the 20 megabyte file. You can do a lot more with it than what you can with the 5 megabyte file. Now, those file sizes are just an example. That's what I've got on my 1DX Mark II. Different cameras, different megapixels will obviously produce different file sizes. Now, how do you determine if your camera's got RAW or JPEG? When you switch your camera on and go to the menu system, it's usually either in the very first or second tab. You'll either have quality, image, something like that, and next to it you'll have a setting. It'll either be RAW, JPG or JPEG, or RAW plus JPEG. Here's a Sony camera. As you can see, the third one down that says quality is RAW plus JPEG. Now if I select that, there's all the different choices that I've got. I can either have a pure RAW file, RAW plus JPEG, fine files, etc. JPEGs. So here's all the different settings that you get on this Sony camera. The fine, extra fine, etc. settings are all JPEG only settings. They're not RAW. And it just controls the amount of information that gets in there, the compression ratios, etc, etc. Every camera is the same. It might be called something slightly different, but whether you've got a Nikon, a Sony, a Canon, they're all very similar. You've all got RAW files, JPEGs, or you can set it to RAW plus JPEG. Every camera allows you to do that. Now, I've talked about post-processing, and that's what you do with a RAW file. You take it into a computer program, something like Adobe Lightroom, and you process the file in there. Chances are you're not going to want the file, like a RAW file as is. You want to go in, you want to do something with it. Adjust the shadows, the highlights, tone, temperature. There's just so much you can do with it, but you can bake it to your own tastes, just like your steak. Whereas a JPEG that comes out of your camera, fairly much that's it. You can take it into something like Adobe Lightroom, but you're very limited in what you can do because the information is just not there. Now, what happens if you can't afford Adobe Lightroom? Your camera will come with processing software with it. The Canon, for example, comes with DPP, Canon's digital processing. I can't remember what the other P stands for. But it's essentially Canon's version of Adobe Lightroom, and it's free. It comes with your camera, so there's no cost to shooting in RAW. So should you shoot in RAW or should you shoot in JPEG? Well, there's really no or in that statement. You should always shoot in RAW. If you really want, you can shoot in RAW plus JPEG, but you should never really shoot JPEG only. Now, why would you want to shoot in RAW plus JPEG? Say, for example, you're on a trip, you want to take a quick photograph, transfer it to your phone and post it on Instagram, for example, right there and then. Take a RAW plus JPEG file. You can take the JPEG, transfer it to your phone, upload it to Instagram, boom, it's there. But you also have the RAW file so that when you get home, you've got a better quality file to work with, and you can make a better image once you're back near a computer. So it should never be a case of RAW or JPEG. It should always be a case of RAW and perhaps RAW plus JPEG. So I've talked a lot about post-processing and what you can do with RAWs and what you can do with JPEGs. Well, let's see an example. Okay, so here we are. As you can see, I've got two files imported into Lightroom. They're the exact same file. One's a RAW file, one's a JPEG. At the camera set on RAW plus JPEG, so the camera actually took one picture and made two files of it, the RAW file and the JPEG file. This is Savannah, Georgia, actually. One of the nice little fountains in one of the squares in Savannah, Georgia. This one, as you can see from the file extension, CR2, is a RAW file. Click over to this one, you can see things starting to get slightly processed. Highlights are different, etc. This is the JPEG file. Now, to me, this file is still too dark. So let's go in and try and edit this file. First of all, we'll enable lens correction. This was shot with a 24-70 f2.8 lens at 7.1 ISO 100, 1/100th of a second. Now, as you noticed, selecting lens correction didn't do anything. So it's still too dark, so let's bring up the shadows. A touch. We're getting grain in this file already. Bring down the highlights, adjust the contrast. Get a little bit more color into it. So there we go. Not too bad. We really need to bring up the shadows more, but we're already at 100%. We can't bring up shadows anymore, so we're losing detail in the file. Now let's try the same thing in the RAW file. This time you'll note that when I've done enable profile for the lens, something actually happened. There's presets built into Lightroom for different manufacturers. Here you've got all the different lenses that are available for the manufacturers, and you can select a profile. This one only has one profile, which is Adobe profile. Basically what it says is for a given lens, it corrects things like barrel distortion, lens aberrations, etc. As you can see, it's sort of stretched out the file just because that's what the 24-70 does, especially at the wide angle. This is taken at 24mm. So same thing again. Let's bring up the shadows. Look how much more we can bring up the shadows. We're not losing detail down here anymore. Bring in the contrast, clarity, take down the highlights because it's too bright out here. Bring in the vibrance. Dehaze just a touch. So there's the JPEG. Look especially down this area here and over here. You're losing a lot of detail, a lot of information. We're already at shadows 100, as high as we can go. But still, there's not as much detail as in this one. You can see a lot more. Can actually bring up the contrast a bit, bring in the clarity a bit more. So which file do you prefer? Here's the JPEG, slightly washed out colors, even although I've got the contrast, saturation, etc. up. Here's the RAW file. A lot more vibrant, a lot more detail, a lot more color. Just as another quick example, I've pulled in another two files. Once again, the exact same thing. They were recorded in RAW plus JPEG, so it's one picture, two files produced. One's a RAW file, one's a JPEG file. This is of the Falcons, taken at Macon, Georgia, I think this air show was. Here's your RAW file, and here's your JPEG. Slightly darker skies. This file is already processed to what the camera thinks is best. But look at the detail we're missing in it. So let's quickly try and process these files. Once again, enable profile corrections doesn't actually do anything on a JPEG file. Let's bring up the shadows. Everything gets taken out of whack. So we'll bring down the whites, bring down the highlights, bring up the contrast a bit. punch in some clarity. We need more shadows and we can't do it. This is the maximum setting we've got. Shadows plus 100. And it's still not enough. Just dehaze it slightly. So here's your JPEG file processed. Now let's try the RAW file. Bring in the shadows. We can actually punch in lens correction on this one. But look how much more detail you've got under here. With shadows at 100, you can just see so much more detail in the picture. Bring down the whites, bring up, punch a little colour into it, probably about 10, dehaze it a touch. JPEG RAW. JPEG RAW. Actually do it, just punching that down just a little bit more. Detail, not as much detail. You can see the individual rivets. Not so much. They're completely gone here, even although shadows are at 100% on both. And there you have it. That's the reason why you should always want to be shooting in RAW. If you want to post a quick snapshot to Instagram or something, shoot RAW plus JPEG, but always keep the RAW. You will regret it later on if you don't have RAW files that you can process from. Disk space nowadays costs virtually nothing, so there's no reason not to shoot in RAW. I hope this video was helpful to you. I hope you learned something from it. Switch your camera now, go pick up your camera and switch it over to RAW or RAW plus JPEG. But make sure you're taking RAW files. If you like this, please subscribe.